How Deep the Grooves by Philip José Farmer, originally published in Amazing Stories, February 1963, narrated by Tom Trussel. Always in control of himself, Dr. James Carroad lowered his voice. He said, "You will submit to this test. We must impress the secretary. The fact that we're willing to use our own unborn baby in the experiment will make that impression a deeper one." Dr. Jane Carroad, his wife, looked up from the chair in which she sat. Her gaze swept over the tall, lean figure in the white scientist's uniform, and the 2 rows of resplendent ribbons and medals on his left chest. She glared into the eyes of her husband. Scornfully, she said, "You did not want this baby. I did, though I wonder why. Perhaps because I wanted to be a mother, no matter what the price, not to give the state another citizen. But now we're going to have it. You want to exploit it even before it's born, just as—" Harshly, he said, "Don't you know what such talk can lead to?" "Don't worry. I won't tell anyone you didn't desire to add to the state, nor will I tell anybody how I induced you to have it." His face became red, and he said, "You will never again mention that to me. Never again, understand?" Jane's neck muscles trembled, but her face was composed. She said, "I'll speak of that to you whenever I feel like it, though God knows I'm thoroughly ashamed of it. But I do get a certain sour satisfaction out of knowing that, once in my life, I managed to break down that rigid self-control. I made you act like a normal man, one able to forget himself in his passion for a woman. Dr. Carroad, the great scientist of the state, really forgot himself then." She gave a short, brittle laugh, and then settled back in the chair as if she would no longer discuss the matter. But he would not, could not, let her have the last word. He said, "I only wanted to see how it felt to throw off all restraints. That was all. An experiment. I didn't care for it. It was disgusting. It'll never happen again." He looked at his wristwatch and said, "Let's go. We must not make the secretary wait." She rose slowly, as if the 8 months' burden was at last beginning to drain her strength. "All right, but I'm submitted our baby to this experiment only under protest. If anything happens to it, a potential citizen—" He spun around. "A written protest?" "I've already sent it in." "You little fool! Do you want to wreck everything I've worked for?" Tears filled her eyes. "James, does the possible harm to our baby mean nothing to you? Only the medals, the promotions, the power?" "Nonsense! There's no danger. If there were, wouldn't I know it? Come along now." But she did not follow him through the door. Instead, she stood with her face against the wall, her shoulders shaking. A moment later, Jason Kramer entered. The young man closed the door behind him and put his arm around her. Without protest, she turned and buried her face in his chest. For a while she could not talk, but could only weep. Finally she released herself from his embrace and said, "Why is it, Jason, that every time I need a man to cry against, James is not with me, but you are?" "Because he is the one who makes you cry," he said, "and I love you." "And James," she said, "loves only himself." "You didn't give me the proper response, Jane. I said I loved you." She kissed him, though lightly, and murmured, "I think I love you, but I'm not allowed to. Please forget what I said. I mean it." She walked away from him. Jason Kramer, after making sure that he had no lipstick on his face or uniform, followed her. Entering the laboratory, Jane Carroad ignored her husband's glare and sat down in the chair in the middle of the room. Immediately thereafter, the Secretary of Science and 2 security bodyguards entered. The secretary was a stocky, dark man of about 50. He had very thick black eyebrows that looked like pieces of fur pasted above his eyes. He radiated the assurance that he was master, in control of all in the room. Yet he did not, as was nervously expected by James Carroad and Jason Kramer, take offence because Jane did not rise from the chair to greet him. He gave her a smile, patted her hand, and said, "Is it true you will bear a male baby?" "That is what the tests indicate," she said. "Good. Another valuable citizen. A scientist, perhaps, with its genetic background." Annoyed because his wife had occupied the centre of the stage for too long, Dr. James Carroad loudly cleared his throat. He said, "Citizens, honoured secretary, I've asked you here for a demonstration because I believe that what I have to show you is of utmost importance to the state's future. I have here the secret of what constitutes a good or bad citizen of the state." He paused for effect, which he was getting, and then continued, "As you know, I, and my associates, of course, have perfected an infallible and swift method whereby an enemy spy or deviationist citizen may be unmasked. This method has been in use for 3 years. During that time it has exposed many thousands as espionage agents, as traitors, as potential traitors." The secretary looked interested. He also looked at his wristwatch. Dr. Carroad refused to notice. He talked on at the same pace. He could justify any amount of time he took, and he intended to use as much as possible. "My department of electroencephalographic research first produced the devices delicate enough to detect the so-called row waves emanated by the human brain, the row or semantic waves. After 10 years of hard work, I correlated the action of the row waves in a particular human brain with the action of the individual's voice mechanisms. That meant, of course, that we had a device which mankind has long dreamed of. Pardon the term, mind-reading machine." Carroad purposely avoided scientific terminology. The secretary did have a Ph.D. in political science, but he knew very little of any biological science. Jason Kramer, at a snap of the fingers by Carroad, wheeled a large, round, shining machine to a spot about 2 feet in front of Jane. It resembled a weird metallic antelope, for it had a long, flexible neck at the end of which was an oval and eyeless head with 2 prongs like horns. These pointed at Jane's skull. On the side of the machine, Cervus III, was a round glass tube, the oscilloscope. Carroad said, "We no longer have to attach electrodes to the subject's head. We've made that method obsolete. Cervus's prongs pick up row waves without direct contact. It is also able to cut out 99.99% of the noise that has hampered us in a previous research." "Yes," thought Jane, "and why don't you tell them that it was Jason Kramer who made that possible instead of allowing them to think it was you?" At that moment she reached the peak of her hate for him. She wished that the swelling sleeper within her was not Carroad's, but Kramer's. And wishing that, she knew that she must be falling in love with Kramer. Carroad's voice slashed into her thoughts. "And so, using the detected row waves, which can be matched against definite objective words, we got a verbal picture of what is going on in the subject's mind at the conscious level." He gave an order to Kramer, and Kramer twisted a dial on the small control board on the side of Cervus. "The machine is now set for semantic relations," Carroad said. "Jane," he added so sharply that she was startled, "repeat this sentence after me, silently." He then gave her a much-quoted phrase from one of the speeches of the secretary himself. She repressed her scorn of him because of his flattery and dutifully concentrated on thinking the phrase. At the same time, she was aware that her tongue was moving in a noiseless lockstep with the thoughts. The round tube on the side of the Cervus glowed, and then began flashing with many twisting threads of light. "The trained eye," said Carroad, "can interpret those waveforms. But we have a surprise for you to whom the patterns are meaningless. We have perfected a means whereby a technician with a minimum of training may operate Cervus. He snapped his fingers. Kramer shot him a look. His face was expressionless, but Jane knew that Kramer resented Carroad's arrogance. Nevertheless, Kramer obeyed. He adjusted a dial, pushed down on a toggle switch, rotated another dial. A voice, tonelessly and tinnily mechanical, issued from a loudspeaker beneath the tube. It repeated the phrase that Carroad had given, and that Jane was thinking. It continued the repetition until Kramer, at another finger snap from Carroad, flicked the toggle switch upward. "As you have just heard," said Carroad triumphantly, "we have converted the waveforms into audible representations of what the subject is thinking." The secretary's brows rose like two caterpillars facing each other, and he said, "Very impressive." But he managed to give the impression that he was thinking. "Is that all?" Carroad smiled. He said, "I have much more. Something that, I'm sure, will please you very much. Now, as you know, this machine, my Cervus, is exposing hundreds of deviationists and enemy agents every year. Yet, this is nothing." He stared fiercely at them, but had a slight smile on the corners of his lips. Jane, knowing him so well, could feel the radiance of his pride at the fact that the secretary was leaning forward and his mouth was open. "I say this is nothing. Catching traitors after they have become deviationists is locking the garage after the car's been stolen. What if we had a system of control whereby our citizens would be unable to be anything but unquestioningly loyal to the state?" The secretary said, "Ah!" "I knew you would be far from indifferent," said Carroad. Carroad pointed a finger downwards. Kramer, slowly, his jaws set, twisted the flexible neck of Cervus so that the pronged head pointed directly at James's distended stomach. He adjusted controls on the board. Immediately the oscilloscope danced with many intricate figures that were so different from the previous forms that even the untutored eyes of the secretary could perceive this change. "Citizens," said Carroad, "for some time after we discovered the row waves in the adult and infant, we searched for their presence in the brain of the unborn child. We had no success for a long time. But that was not because the row waves did not exist in the embryo. No, it was because we did not have delicate enough instruments. However, a few weeks ago, we succeeded in building one. I experimented upon my unborn child, and I detected weak traces of the row waves. Thus, I demonstrated that the ability to form words is present, though in undeveloped form, even in the 8-month embryo. You're probably wondering what this means. This knowledge does not enable us to make the infant or the unborn speak any sooner. True. But what it does allow us to do is—" Jane, who had been getting more tense with every word, became rigid. Would he allow this to be done to his own son, his own flesh and blood? Would he permit his child to become a half-robot, an obedient slave to the state, incapable in certain fields of wielding the power of free will? The factor that most marked men from the beasts and the machine. Numbly, she knew he would. To probe well-defined areas in the undeveloped mind and there to stamp into it certain inhibitory paths. These inhibitions, preconditioned reflexes, as it were, will not, of course, take effect until the child has learned a language, and developed the concepts of citizen and state. But once that is done, the correlation between the semantic waves and the inhibitions is such that the subject is unable to harbour any doubts about the teachings of the state, or those who interpret the will of the state for its citizens. It is not necessary to perform any direct or physical surgery upon the unborn. The reflexes will be installed by Cervus III within a few minutes. As you see, Cervus cannot only receive, it can also transmit. Place a recording inside that receptacle beneath the speaker. Actuate it, and in short time you have traced in the grooves of the brain, if you will pardon an unscientific comparison, the voice of the state." There was a silence. Jane and Kramer were unsuccessful in hiding their repulsion, but the others did not notice them. The secretary and his bodyguards were staring at Carroad. After several minutes, the secretary broke the silence. "Dr. Carroad, are you sure that this treatment will not harm the creative abilities of the child? After all, we might make a first-class citizen, in the political sense, out of your child, yet we might wreck his potentialities as a first-class scientist. If we do that to our children, we lose out in the technological race, not to mention the military. We need great generals, too." "Absolutely not," replied Carroad, so loudly and flatly that the secretary was taken aback. "My computations, rechecked at least a dozen times, show there is no danger whatsoever. The only part of the brain affected, a very small area, has nothing to do with the creative functions. To convince you, I'm going to perform the first operation upon my own son. Surely I could do nothing more persuasive than that." "Yes," said the secretary, stroking his massive chin. "By the way, can this be done also to the adult?" "Unfortunately, no," said Carroad. "Then we will have to wait a number of years to determine if your theory is correct, and if we go ahead on the assumption that the theory is correct, and treat every unborn child in the country, we will have spent a tremendous amount of money and time. If you are not correct—" "I can't be wrong," said Carroad. His face began to flush, and he shook. Then suddenly his face was its normal colour, and he was smiling. Always in control, thought Jane, of himself, and if circumstances would allow, of everybody. "We don't have to build any extra machines," said Carroad. "A certain amount will be built anyway to detect traitors and enemies. These can be used in hospitals, when not in use elsewhere, to condition the unborn. Wait, I will show you how simple, inexpensive, and swift the operation is." He gestured to Kramer. Kramer, the muscles twitching at the corners of his mouth, looked at Jane. His eyes tried desperately to tell her that he had to obey Carroad's orders. But if he did, would he be understood? Would he be forgiven? Jane could only sit in the chair with a face as smooth and unmoving as a robot's, and allow him to decide for himself without one sign of dissent or consent from her. What, after all, could either do unless they wished to die? Kramer adjusted the controls. Even though Jane knew she would feel nothing, she trembled as if a fist were poised to strike. Bright peaks and valleys danced on the face of the oscilloscope. Carroad, watching them, gave orders to Kramer to move the prongs in minute spirals. When he had located the area he wished, he told Kramer to stop. "We have just located the exact chain of neurons which are to be altered. You will hear nothing from the speaker, because the embryo, of course, has no language. However, to show you some slight portion of Cervus' capabilities, Kramer will stimulate the area responsible for the row waves before we begin the so-called inhibiting. Watch the scope. You'll see the waves go from a regular pulse into a wild dance." The cyclopean eye of the oscilloscope became a field of crazed lines, leaping like a horde of barefooted and wire-thin fakirs on a bed of hot coals. And a voice boomed out, "Nusay, Nusay, wanna dink?" James cried out, "God, what was that?" The secretary was startled. Kramer's face paled. Carroad was frozen. But he recovered quickly, and he spoke sharply. "Kramer, you must have shifted the prongs so they picked up James's thought." I never touched them." "Those were not my thoughts," said Jane. "Something's wrong," said Carroad needlessly. "Here, I'll do the adjusting." He bent the prongs a fraction, checked the controls, and then turned the power on again. The mechanical voice of Cervus spoke again. "What you mean? What you saying? My father's not crazy. He's a great scientist, a hero of the state. What do you mean, not any more? The secretary leaped up from the chair and shouted above Cervus's voice, "What is this?" Carroad turned the machine off and said, I don't know. Jane had never seen him so shaken. "Well, find out. That's your business." Carroad's hand shook. One eye began to twitch, but he bent again to the adjustment of the dials. He directed the exceedingly narrow beam along the area from which the semantic waves originated. Only a high-pitched gabble emerged from the speaker, for Carroad had increased the speed. It was as if he were afraid to hear the normal rate of speech. Jane's eyes began to widen. A thought was dawning palely, but horribly on the horizon of her mind. If, by some intuition, she was just beginning to see the truth. But no, that could not be. But, as Carroad worked, as the beam moved, as the power was raised or lowered, so did the voice, though always the same in tone and speed, change in phrase. Carroad had slowed the speed of detection, and individual words could be heard, but it was obvious that the age level of the speaker was fluctuating. Yet, throughout the swiftly leaping sentences, there was a sameness, an identity of personality. Sometimes it was a baby just learning the language. At other times it was an adolescent or a young boy. "Well, man, what is it?" bellowed the secretary. The mysterious voice had struck sparks of even his iron nerves. Jane answered for her husband. "I'll tell you what it is. It's the voice of my unborn son." "Jane, you're insane," said Carroad. "No, I'm not, though I wish I were." "God, he's at the window," boomed the voice, "and he has a knife. What can I do? What can I do?" "Turn that off until I get through talking," said Jane. "Then you can listen again and see if what I'm saying isn't true." Carroad stood like a statue, his hand extended towards the toggle switch, but not reaching it. Kramer reached past him and flicked the switch. "James," she said, speaking slowly and with difficulty, "you want to make robots out of everyone. Except, of course, yourself and the state's leaders. But what if I told you that you don't have to do that? That nature, or God, or whatever you care to call the Creator, has anticipated you, and done so by several billion years. Now don't look at me that way. You'll see what I mean. Now look. The only one whose thoughts you could possibly have trapped is your son. Yes, it's impossible for an unborn baby to have a knowledge of speech. Nevertheless, you heard thoughts, originated by a boy, seeming to run from the first years of speech up to those of an adolescent. You have to admit that, even if you don't know what it means. Well, I do." Tears running down her cheeks, choking, she said, "Maybe I see the truth where you don't because I'm closer to my baby. It's part of me. Oh, I know you'll say I'm talking like a silly woman. Maybe. Anyway, I think that what we've heard means that we, all of humanity without exception, are machines. Not steel and electrical robots, no, but still machines of flesh, engines whose behaviour, motives, and very thoughts, conscious or unconscious, spring from the playing of protein tapes in our brains." "What the hell are you talking about?" said Carroad. "If I'm right, we are in hell," she said, "through no fault or choice of ours. Listen to me before you shut your ears because you don't want to hear, can't hear. Memories are not recordings of what has happened in our past, nor do we act as we will. We speak and behave according to our memories, which are not recorded after the fact. They're recorded before the fact. Our actions are such because our memories tell us to do such. Each of us is set like a clockwork doll. No, not independently, but intermeshed, working together, synchronized as a master clock or master plan decrees. And all this time we think we are creatures of free will and chance, but we do not know there isn't such a thing as chance, that all is plotted and foretold, and we are sliding over the world, through time in predetermined grooves. We, body and mind, are walking recordings. Deep within ourselves, a molecular needle follows the grooves, and we follow the needle. Somehow, this experiment has ripped the cover from the machine, showed us the tape, stimulated it into working long before it was supposed to. Suddenly, she began laughing, and between laughing and gasping she said, "What am I saying? It can't be an accident. If we have discovered that we're puppets, it's because we're supposed to do so."
"Jane, Jane," said Carroad, "you're wild, foolish woman's intuition. You're supposed to be a scientist. Stop talking. Control yourself."
The secretary bellowed for silence, and after a minute succeeded. He said, "Mrs. Carroad, please continue. We'll get to the bottom of this." He, too, was pale and wide-eyed, but he had not gotten to his position by refusing to attack. She ordered Kramer to run the beam again over the previous areas. He was to speed up the process and slow down only when she so directed. The result was a stream of unintelligibilities. Occasionally, when Kramer slowed service at a gesture from Jane, it broke into a rate of speech they could understand, and when it did, they trembled. They could not deny that they were speeding over the life thoughts of a growing male named James Carroad, Jr. Even at the velocity at which they travelled, and the great jumps in time that the machine had to make in order to cover the track quickly, they could tell that. After an hour, Jane had Kramer cut off the voice. In the silence, looking at the white and sweating men, she said, "We are getting close to the end. Should we go on?" Hoarsely the secretary shouted, "This is a hoax! I can prove it must be. It's impossible. If we carry the seeds of predeterminism within us, and yet, as now, we discover how to foresee what we shall do, why can't we change the future?" "I don't know, Mr. Secretary," said Jane. "We'll find out, in time. I can tell you this. If anyone is preset to foretell the future, he'll do so. If no one is, then the problem will go begging. It all depends on whoever wound us up."
"That's blasphemy,"
howled the secretary, a man noted for his belligerent atheism. But he did not order the voice to stop after Jane told Kramer to start the machine up again. Kramer ran service at full speed. The words became a staccato of incomprehensibility, the oscilloscope an almost solid blur. Flickers of blackness told of broad jumps forward, and then the wild intertwined lightning resumed. Suddenly, the oscilloscope went blank, and the voice was silent. Jane Carroad said, "Backtrack a little, Jason, and then run it forward at normal speed." James Carroad had been standing before her, rigid, a figure seemingly made of white metal, his face almost as white as his uniform. Abruptly, he broke into fluidity and lurched out of the laboratory. His motions were broken, his shouts broken also.
"Won't stay to listen. Rot. Mysticism. Believe this. Go insane. Mean. No control. No control."
And his voice was lost as the door closed behind him. Jane said, "I don't want to hear this, Jason, but—" Instantly the voice boomed, "God, he's at the window, and he has a knife! What can I do? What can I do? Father, Father, I'm your son! He knows it, yet he's going to kill me! The window! He's breaking it! Oh, Lord, he's been locked up for 19 years, ever since he shot and killed my mother and all those men, and I was born a Caesarean, and I didn't know he'd escape and still want to kill me, though they told me that's all he talked about, raving mad, and—" The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past.